Last week was a hell of a week over at the Washington Post. They posted all sorts of loony articles. The most loony is obviously this business about the austere religious scholar, but the second most loony is the one by this joker, Richard Stengal. It's entitled, Why America Needs a Hate Speech Law. Now, I could tell this article was going to be a train wreck before I even clicked on it, but I couldn't help myself. Now, Richard Stengal is some kind of former journalist who also worked for the Obama administration. You know what? I really just don't even care. I don't know why I punish myself by reading these woke articles, but here we go, I guess.
When I was a journalist, I loved Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s assertion that the Constitution and the First Amendment are not just about protecting free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate.
He really should have just ended the article right here. He didn't even need to write an article. He could have just tweeted this.
But as a government official traveling around the world championing the virtues of free speech, I came to see how our First Amendment standard is an outlier.
I'm going to go ahead and say, so what? It's kind of good that we're an outlier. America is unusual and exceptional in a variety of different ways. Why are we assuming this is a bad thing? This is starting to sound suspiciously like that globalist mentality where if the majority of other countries are doing something one way and we're doing it another way, then we must be wrong. But if we look at this map from Freedom House, you'll see that the majority of other countries have an absolutely rotten record on freedom, so why should we care what they think of us? Anyway, I'll get back to it.
Even the most sophisticated Arab diplomats that I dealt with did not understand why the First Amendment allows someone to burn a Koran. Why, they asked me, would you ever want to protect that?
Well, the obvious answer to that question is we don't trust the government to police speech properly. You know, there's some countries out there that are so bad at policing speech that if you say even mild things by American standards, you might get shot, beheaded, thrown off a roof, set on fire, or maybe even carved up in an embassy. This is quite common in Arab countries, even the more sophisticated ones.
It's a fair question.
Not really. But anyway, carry on.
Yes, the First Amendment protects the thought that we hate, but it should not protect hateful speech that can cause violence by one group against another. In an age when everyone has a megaphone, that seems like a design flaw.
Well, the problem there is it's really hard to define what is and what is not hateful speech. Oftentimes it's a matter of opinion. For example, you might arrest some Scottish guy because he taught his dog, or actually his girlfriend's dog, I think, to do a Hitler salute.
Sieg Heil!
If there's a hate speech law on the books, even a relatively unoppressive country like the United Kingdom might end up finding this guy, or possibly even throwing him in jail. Anyway, let's get back to it.
It is important to remember that our First Amendment doesn't just protect the good guys. Our foremost liberty also protects any bad actors who hide behind it to weaken our society.
Yeah, you're going to need to define the difference between good guys and bad actors. I think that's a matter of opinion.
In the weeks leading up to the 2016 election, Russia's Internet Research Agency planted false stories hoping they would go viral. They did. Russian agents assumed faked identities, promulgated false narratives, and spread lies on Twitter and Facebook, all protected by the First Amendment. Russians understood that our free press and its reflex toward balance and fairness would enable Moscow to slip its destructive ideas into our media ecosystem. When Putin said back in 2014 that there were no Russian troops in Crimea, an outright lie, he knew our media would report it, and we did.
I think you may have wandered a bit. I thought this article was supposed to be about hate speech. Besides, if I remember correctly, we reported that, but we also debunked that. Seems like the First Amendment was working just fine.
That's partly because the intellectual underpinning of the First Amendment was engineered for a simpler era. The amendment rests on the notion that the truth will win out in what Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas called the marketplace of ideas. This marketplace model has a long history going back to 17th century English intellectual John Milton. But in all that time, no one ever quite explained how good ideas drive out the bad ones, how truth triumphs over falsehood.
Well, usually that's done through fact-checking. Don't they have a fact-checker over there at WaPo?
Milton, an early opponent of censorship, said truth would prevail in a free and open encounter. A century later, The framers believed that this marketplace was necessary for people to make informed choices in a democracy. Somehow, magically, truth would emerge. The presumption has always been that the marketplace would offer a level playing field. But in the age of social media, that landscape is neither level nor fair.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, we're assuming that the 17th and 18th centuries were a simpler era. I think you might have forgotten, but any jackass could go to a printing press and print out all kind of BS, pass it around on the street, or sell it. It was a free and open marketplace, and all kind of crazy crap was going on. The truth wins out when enough people who will take the time to read up on things will see that certain things can stand the test of fact-checking and certain things can't. There's nothing magical about it. And I don't see how you could possibly say that the age of social media is not level or fair. Anybody can start a blog. Anybody can network with other bloggers and spread ideas. The fact that a few Russians got together in a building and started posting BS doesn't mean the rest of us can't push back, either as individuals or a group. The fact that so much of that Russian stuff was debunked proves that it's possible. That if anything, the social media landscape is far more level and fair than the press has ever been before.
On the internet, truth is not optimized. On the web, it's not enough to battle falsehood with truth. The truth doesn't always win.
Actually, the truth does eventually win. But like the old saying says, a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on, or its pants on, or whatever.
In the age of social media, the marketplace model doesn't work.
I think I proved just a few minutes ago that it does.
A 2016 Stanford study showed that 82% of middle schoolers couldn't distinguish between an ad labeled sponsored content and an actual news story.
You know, when I was 12, there was a lot of stuff I wasn't sophisticated enough to distinguish between. Maybe you should redo that with some people who are at least in their late 20s.
Only a quarter of high school students could tell the difference between an actual verified news site and one from a deceptive account designed to look like a real one.
Again, with the children, try using adults. I think running a test on high schoolers who have no real expense with the news, and certainly with middle schoolers, doesn't really tell us anything useful. Also, if you're new to the media landscape, maybe get fooled the first few times. I can think of a few times in the past where I've sent BS news stories out on my Facebook account, and I had all my friends laugh at me. So I learned the hard way, not to get taken in by these BS news sites.
Since World War II, many nations have passed laws to curb the incitement of racial and religious hatred. These laws started out as protections against the kind of anti-Semitic bigotry that gave rise to the Holocaust. We call them hate speech laws, but there's no agreed-upon definition of what hate speech actually is.
I think that's your problem there, pal. There's no agreed-upon definition. And if we don't have an agreed-upon definition, it's very hard to write a law to carve out what's hate speech and what's not.
In general, hate speech is speech that attacks and insults people on the basis of race, religion, ethnic origin, and sexual orientation. I think it's time to consider these statutes. The modern standard of dangerous speech comes from Brandenburg v. Ohio, 1969, and holds that speech that directly incites imminent lawless action, or is likely to do so, can be restricted. Domestic terrorists such as Dylan Roof and Omar Mateen and the El Paso shooter were consumers of hate speech.
I wonder why I forgot to mention the Dayton, Ohio guy.
Speech doesn't pull the trigger, but does anyone seriously doubt that such hateful speech creates a climate where such acts are more likely?
No, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but the trick here is, should policing speech be the approach? Seems like we'd have a very hard time doing it fairly. Other countries who've tried this have ended up putting all sorts of people in jail who really didn't do anything that terrible. Not to mention the Scottish guy I was talking about earlier.
Let the debate begin. Hate speech has a less violent but nearly as damaging impact in another way. It diminishes tolerance. It enables discrimination. Isn't that, by definition, speech that undermines the values that the First Amendment was designed to protect? Fairness, due process, equality before the law?
No, the First Amendment wasn't designed to protect any of those things. Those things are covered in other parts of the Constitution. The First Amendment, as well as many other rights in the Bill of Rights, were designed as safety valves to protect us from the government. If the government institutions failed, the people would have rights that they could exercise and correct it themselves. We can push back against the government with our right to freedom of speech, our right to freedom of the press, and our right to petition and assemble peacefully.
Why shouldn't the states experiment with their own version of hate speech statutes to penalize speech that deliberately insults people based on religion, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation?
Well, Massachusetts is considering a law that would probably get a lot of rappers thrown in jail. We'll see. But something tells me this is going to be unconstitutional.
All speech is not equal.
Yeah, that's true. But that's not really up for government to decide.
And where the truth cannot drive out lies, we must add new guardrails. I'm all for protecting thought that we hate, but not speech that incites hate. It undermines the very values of a fair marketplace of ideas that the First Amendment is designed to protect.
No, it doesn't. Free speech is designed to allow people to have free public debate, to share ideas without having to worry about the government throwing us in jail, even very radical ideas. Sometimes the new radical ideas are better than the existing ideas, but to some people they may be considered extremely dangerous or hateful. So if we were to shut down these new ideas, we would risk becoming a stagnant society which didn't advance anywhere. I'm wondering if maybe some of the things the Founding Fathers said might have been considered hate speech by the British government. And while it's true that hate speech might influence someone to commit violence, what's also true is that non-hate speech might influence someone to commit violence. How many times has the Bible, which includes ideals like loving thy neighbor and doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, been used to excuse violence? How many times has the Quran, which likens the murder of innocents to the murder of all mankind, been used to excuse the murder of innocents? So if a form of speech is used as an excuse for violence, is that something we should punish? I mean, if someone says something that somehow results in another person committing violence, that speech must have somehow incited hate or at least anger. So that would mean any speech which results in violence must be hate speech. Not that it would matter in these two cases. Muhammad is long dead and Jesus was already crucified. So I'm not sure how much we could do to either one of them. But if we're punishing speech that leads to violence, there are two people who have not been caught yet. Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney. They're the only two remaining Beatles, and years ago they were complicit in the production of the White Album. And the White Album had a couple of memorable hits on it. One guy who found this very inspiring was a notorious young man named Charles Manson. After hearing the song Helter Skelter, he decided that there was some sort of subliminal message about the four horsemen of the apocalypse and a coming race war or something, and decided this was a good reason to form a cult and have them start killing people. And they did, killing the pregnant wife of Roman Polanski, the heiress to the Folgers fortune, and an aspiring screenwriter named Wojciech Frykowski, amongst others. The last one they must have really wanted dead, since they clubbed him over the head, stabbed him over 50 times, and shot him twice. Since the speech of the Beatles inspired this violence, they must not go unpunished. And there's only two left that can be punished, unless you want to include that Pete Best guy. So Paul and Ringo must face justice because they did not foresee the impact their ill-considered words had on the impressionable young Mr. Manson. I mean, I guess we could focus on identifying and punishing the crazy people who abuse the ideas of others. But if Mr. Stengal is right, hate speech regulation doesn't go far enough. Any speech could be used to justify violence, and it would be impossible to determine which speech would likely lead to violence. So any speech that does lead to violence must be punished to the fullest extent of the law. People need to know that anything they say could be considered harmful speech. In fact, it's probably best if people don't speak at all.